And this one is a cooperative boss battler where you're going to be choosing a boss, choosing elite enemies to pair with that boss, and also choosing the characters you want to play as. And then the overall scenario is going to be determined by all of those decisions, as well as the environment you choose to play in. And then you're also going to be drawing environment cards that can modify different aspects of the battlefield. This one's not a campaign game, but there are going to be some cards and components that are locked away. And as you're leveling up your character, you'll be able to unlock those cards permanently, being allowed to use them in future scenarios. This is a game that takes place in a Victorian era where each player is going to be playing as a different hunter trying to take out that final boss. Each player is going to have their own asymmetrical abilities, and this is a game that uses dice worker placement, and each player might have different dice that they're going to be working with because the dice do come in different colors that can have different themes or effects, or also different restrictions as to where they can be placed. But players do have their own player board where they're going to have some basic actions where you'll be able to put those dice to take those, but then there's also going to be various cards that you'll be starting with and upgrading to throughout the game that will give you new worker placement locations. The way that you actually upgrade your character in this game is by collecting different corruption tokens and then spending those at the start of your turn in order to move up this track. Certain locations on this track will allow you to choose an upgrade, and normally that allows you to pick between two cards, or instead to add another die into your pool. But what's really cool about this upgrade track is that once you get halfway through the track, you're actually going to be flipping your character over to its corrupted side. This completely changes the miniature that you're going to be using to represent your character, and it's also going to be introducing some different effects and abilities that are going to come along with that. Of course, gaining corruption doesn't sound like that much of a positive thing, and although it can help you level up your character and get a lot more stronger, it also does come with some side effects with the fact that you'll have to draw a corruption card every time that you upgrade your character, which normally has some sort of negative effect depending on your current corruption at the point of drawing that card. But the way that players actually gain corruption is by defeating enemies out on the board or moving to certain areas in order to acquire where the corruption has accumulated. The rounds in this game alternate between the player's turns and then the enemy turn, and the way that this works is that during a player's turn they're going to be rolling their dice and then assigning it to the various locations out on their board or cards in order to take those different actions to move around on the board, prepare for an attack, attack the enemy, or even help the other players. And then of course trying to get yourself to a safe spot so that you aren't completely destroyed when it's the enemy's turn. Weaker enemies normally do just have a single health, which makes them a little bit easier to knock off the board, but they do spawn back each and every round. And then the elite enemies can behave a little bit differently depending on the ones that you included in the game, but they are more difficult and do have their own stats and effects. And then of course, each of the bosses are going to be playing very different from each other. But what's interesting about the bosses is that each of them are going to have their own deck of cards, and you're going to be trying to destroy each of those cards. This means that as you're defeating those cards and sending them back to the box, you might actually change the way that the boss operates or the way that you might have to attack them in order to deal any damage. If you're able to destroy that final card, then you win the game, but of course the enemies aren't going to make it easy because on the enemy's turn, you're first going to be checking if there are any events in play, and then you're going to be resolving the effects of that, but then you're going to be activating each of the enemies, starting with the weaker ones and then moving up to the stronger ones and then the boss. The weaker enemies are going to attack if they're able to, but if they're not, then they're just going to increase their defense, whereas the more elite enemies will actually seek out the players if they're not able to attack them, but of course if they are able to, they're just going to issue that attack. And of course, depending on which enemies you included, this could operate a little bit differently from game to game, but then the boss is going to have its own sequence of actions that you're going to be following through with, depending on the state of the boss and which of the boss cards you've defeated already. These can be quite devastating, but there are different things that players can do during their turn in order to modify the action that the boss is going to perform. The game continues like this until either the players are defeated or that boss is defeated. And if you do want to learn more about this one, there's a lot to check out over on their GameFound page. You can find this one down in the description below.